Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is September 1st, 2021, and I have an unusual couple of videos today, Yaron Brook double feature. Somehow two different viewers, both suggested videos featuring Yaron Brook. Who is Yaron Brook? I didn't know, actually. Yaron Brook is a libertarian, Ayn Rand, objectivist psychopath. No offense to less harmful psychopaths, but objectivism is basically a philosophy which says greed is good, unironically, that, quote, rational selfishness is the way to go, etc. Anyway, Yaron Brook is, believe he was born in South Africa and then later lived in Israel. He was in the Israeli military, became like a sergeant, I think, in Israeli military intelligence. Anyway, now he is promoting Ayn Rand objectivist libertarianism, so that's who that guy is. The first video, he is debating altruism with a channel favorite here at Socialism for All, David, I'm a fucking douchebag, Pakman. I hate this guy. Even, I don't like any of the Sockdem gang really politically. But Pakman to me is just one of the worst of them. He's one of the furthest right within that social democratic crowd. So anyway, here he is doing what these people often do, the social democrats and radical liberals. They will debate somebody from the real far right, like Yaron Brook, and then it kind of makes their, tepid reformed capitalism look a little bit tastier. But that's only if you are denied and deprived of actual socialist voices such as mine and other channels doing this kind of thing. So we're about to watch a liberal, Pakman, and a conservative, Brook, debate whether being a total selfish asshole is a good idea, and then me, a communist, telling you why they're both wrong and limited.
It's great to welcome back to the program Yaron Brook, who's the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, host of the Yaron Brook Show. This is the second in a series of discussions that we're producing in partnership with the Ayn Rand Institute. We have already talked a little bit about Ayn Rand, a bit about objectivism, and the conversation started to get into some of the real-world considerations, the economic and government systems that might stem from Ayn Rand's philosophy. And I think it makes sense at this point, Yaron, to get into capitalism. And because so much about our discussion has been about ethics and morality, really to talk a little bit about the morality of capitalism. But in order to do that, I think we first have to talk a little bit about how we define what is moral. What is a moral system? How would we evaluate that? What would Ayn Rand say about defining the morality of a system?
Okay, so before he opens his mouth, let me jump in. Asking what would Ayn Rand think is moral? I couldn't think of somebody I would less want to know, their idea of morality. I mean, maybe Dick Cheney. Ayn Rand is one of the worst human beings who has ever walked the earth. And my understanding of her is that her family were wealthy in Russia. They lost things during the revolution. They were capitalists, and she never got over it and couldn't see the value in it. And then her entire life became a crusade to, it was just blatant anti-communism. When people try to say that some kind of left-right alliance is possible, no. Libertarianism is fundamentally anti-communism. So the idea that communists and anti-communists, whose entire purpose is to destroy communism, the idea that we're going to work together on what? Anyway, certainly not on ending capitalism or anything vaguely connected to it, because libertarians' entire purpose is to defend capitalism. So getting into the questions of morality, capitalism definitely is not a moral system. But that's not really where we're coming from as Marxists looking at it. Capitalism was a step up over feudalism that basically reflected society's accommodation of the Industrial Revolution. So you had all these new technologies changing the way that people produced shelter and food and clothing and all the other goods and services that we produce and consume. Capitalism all this new technology came rushing in, the steam engine and agricultural technology, all these things. And feudalism just was not sufficient for managing all of that. So the capitalists who controlled these new means of production, these new machines of industry and, everything associated with them, were able to break through their political power. Capitalism since has been enjoying an uneasy reign as the dominant mode of production, and it has multiple challenges in the last 100 years, and we see some of them are still afloat. China, Vietnam, and other countries. The Soviet Union, unfortunately, did get tripped up and was dissolved against the wishes of 76% of its population, but anyway, it is no more. But certainly challenges to capitalism are still in the works. Class struggle is still going on. And capitalism, like I said, an uneasy reign. It's an unstable system. It's unpopular. And why is that? This gets into the morality. So does it work for most people? No. No, it does not. It's burying the world in garbage. It's causing climate emergency. It is polluting nature rampantly. As an economic system, it is creating massive wealth inequality that is just tearing at the fabric of society. People, like in the United States where I live, are some of the unhappiest people in the world because of capitalism, frankly. Yes, there is stuff. We can get bananas. We can get coffee for cheap. But housing, education, medical care, and a whole host of other things are out of reach for many people. And this just goes on and on. Fundamentally, capitalism is a system based on war, violence, exploitation. Even the nicer kinds, like David Pakman will probably say at some point that he represents, those depend on the United States and all the wars that it's waging. You want to go to Scandinavia or something like that. These are just fringes of the empire, client states of that fundamental ugly engine at the middle of it. Capitalism runs on empire, war, greed, and destruction. There's just really no other way to say it. So whether you look at ecological consequences, sociological consequences, it's been a path of devastation that, yes, we have a lot of technology now, and we have developed the ability to do a lot of things. However, capitalism is actually holding us back. Society needs to be reorganized around high technology. We don't need capitalists anymore. We could have a totally new political apparatus. We're not going to get it by voting it in. We're going to get it by revolution only because the capitalists will use all of that technology and power to hang on to what they've got now. But is it moral? No, it works for capitalists, and it really doesn't work for anybody else, starting with the human working class and just working your way on down through all the species on Earth. Anyway, let's see what this fucking crazed laissez-faire capitalist has to say.
So again, let's start with individual morality. Individual morality is a morality where your life is the standard, and where your moral purpose is your own happiness. So a moral political economic system would be a system that allowed you to do that, left you free in a sense to be able to achieve your own happiness.
So I'm going to stop him right there. Does capitalism actually do that for most people? No, it does not. The overwhelming majority of the world's population does not have that opportunity. Now, the way he phrased it is the system leaves you alone to somehow magically get that happiness. The thing is that capitalists, like, how do you become a capitalist? Well, there's not much class mobility, meaning there's not room at the top. Moving up is virtually impossible. A few people do it, but by and large, it's, a few people at the top, intergenerational wealth, it's inherited, etc. So right there, does capitalism do that? No, it's not in most people's interests. Therefore, even in this guy's own terms, of rational selfishness and enlightened self-interest and all this stuff, is it in most working people's interest? No, because capitalist interests and workers' interests are diametrically opposed. And in capitalism, you always have a small capitalist class, the 1%, the 5%, the 10% at most, even if we're counting like petty bourgeois, small employers. And the other 90 to 99% of people have diametrically opposed interests. We're the ones having our surplus value extracted, the goods and services we produce being taken from us as we make them at the workplace. They become the property of the capitalist. Having money taken from us as interest, as rent. And we're not given the opportunity in most cases to realistically do anything different. So boom, you're done with the first thing this guy said. Anyway, here we go.
Now, for Rand, achieving one's happiness requires the use of reason. We talked about this last time. It's a life guided by one's reason. It's a rational life. It's a thinking man's life, right? It's one that relies on facts. So one of the things, so the question then becomes, if I want to live a life guided by my reason with the goal of my own happiness is my purpose, what kind of world, when I get into a society with other people, what kind of conditions do I need in order to sustain that kind of life? So the question is, well, what would threaten? What is it about other people that might threaten my ability to achieve happiness, to follow my reason? What is the enemy of reason? Well, the enemy of reason, according to Rand, and I would agree, is force.
Okay, I'm jumping in again. I don't know why, but I was really expecting more. I was expecting to have more to argue against and to have more to just work with here in terms of what he's saying. This is brainless. I mean, this guy, I know why I was expecting more, because this guy's like on the board of the Objectivist Institute or whatever, the Ayn Rand Institute. He's like the leading light, or one of them. I mean, he's like one of the best and brightest of these fucking troop of morons. So what he's saying right here, this is nice and theoretical. Like, okay, well, force and reason. Listen, we can use social statistics to measure outcomes. We don't need to rely on these abstract philosophical notions. Also, these conversations, we on this channel do a lot of Lenin audiobooks. I still still been one of the main things for me on the channel, because what Lenin wrote between like 1900 and 1920 or so, I just see it as being so relevant to the US today, which may be in a pre-revolutionary kind of situation, similar to Russia, prior to 1917. It's scary to me, the similarities. I mean, it's like, wow, people say, Marxism is not relevant anymore. Like, no, capitalism is still capitalism. It's still the same capitalism Marx was writing about. The only difference is technology. Like, they're more efficient at extracting your surplus labor. Society's more productive. Therefore, exploitation is going on at a deeper and grander level. Otherwise, it's exactly the same, because property relations are the same. Like, capitalism itself is the same. So this guy's talking about reason and living a rational life through thinking. Well, actually, capitalism, for most working people, does not educate you well, and it basically asks you to live, or demands that you live, spending most of your time, your waking life, doing jobs that reduce you to like the level of an animal. So how much dignity and rationality is there in that? And how do we have a more dignified life? Well, this conversation, as I started to say, this was had 100 years ago and more by Lenin, by Marx, by Engels. They figured out new social systems that they had to forcefully overthrow the bourgeoisie in order to be able to implement them. And they did. And they came up with new ways to live. And then other countries did the same. Because capitalism doesn't give you dignity or the opportunity for a rational life. Maybe it does that for rich people, but most people will never be rich. Therefore, this is really not in most people's interests. So, they can talk this good theoretical game. Look at social statistics. I mean, sociology's come a long way. We know how different policies and systems impact the people who live under them and participate in them. And this guy's just relying on, who's the audience for libertarians? Mostly white guys who are super arrogant and socially clueless, right? Have I just described accurately most libertarians? They often also have the second or the third or the fourth after their name, things like that. I mean, this is just such a tiny bracket. I've known libertarians, and it's like, you just look at them sometimes and it's like, is there something wrong with your brain? They're like unreachable. It's so strange. But anyway, let's let this guy continue. He hasn't made an ounce of sense so far. I mean, at least as far as trying to apply what he's saying to capitalism. And you're saying, let him talk, let him. Okay, I'll let him talk. Here we go.
Coercion, an authority that dictates to us, this is the truth, and you can't change it. So, think about Galileo. Galileo can think about, his new theory, but as soon as he presents it and it's rejected and he's put in house arrest, well, I mean, he's not developing it. He's not broadening it. It seriously limits the scope of his thinking, because he knows that if he pushes the envelope a little bit, they're going to shoot him. Well, they can't shoot him in those days. They'll burn him at the stake. The ultimate enemy of human reason and human rationality is force, coercion, authority. So that's the one thing we have to extract from human interaction. We have to leave individuals free to think what they want and to act on those thoughts. And as long as they're not using coercion on others, leave them free.
So here's another gigantic problem with libertarianism and, often with defenders of capitalism generally, but libertarians in particular, who try to use this no force, no fraud rule, or what they call the NAP. Most libertarians need a NAP, the non-aggression principle. So by defining coercion and force down to just literally, I pull a gun on you and say, do it, that's just laughable from a sociological perspective. That's not the extent of how coercion occurs. Imagine, for example, you have a system such as the one that we have, where the basic essentials of life have been commodified. In order to get water, food, shelter, education, medical care, you need money. All right? How do you get that money? Well, where does money come from? It goes through banks, it gets lent out to people and businesses, and then, people will get jobs at the businesses, and then the business will pay them wages, and it becomes profitable through the exploitation of those employees. And so most people have to get wages. You're either a capitalist or a worker, basically. You're either getting that loan from the bank and then working other people and, taking customers' money, and you don't give the profits to the people who actually did the work, your employees. You keep it for yourself. And then you have plenty of money. And then your employees, if you're paying them a wage that covers what they actually need, then, that's how they get their money and they go about their life. Well, so what actual choice do those employees have? They have the choice to work for you or to work for somebody just like you. Can they actually say what they think to you? Probably not, because you can fire them unless they have some kind of contract, which are increasingly hard to come by in the US. So, but, to libertarians, as long as the employer didn't pull a gun on you, it's, quote, not force. Do you see the problem with this? We live in a society with all kinds of coercion, but because it is not the kinds that libertarians focus on, they can just say, oh, that's not coercive. Well, actually, yeah, because effectively people don't have a choice, and then the capitalists just wield all that power over our lives. So this is super elementary. If you're new to this channel, Socialism for All, we talk about stuff way more advanced than this. And if you're still on this level, please get caught up, because what this guy's talking about, this is warmed over 1776 stuff. He's talking about Galileo. This is centuries ago. And the discussion of what is possible in society in terms of economic and social systems has dramatically moved on. The United States is no longer fighting a monarchy. It is no longer an agrarian society. It is not 1776. But that's all these people have to sell you, is that incredibly outdated ideology that gave rise to our present system. So if you don't like the way the present system works, don't subscribe to this. It is more of the same, not different. And if you do like the current system, ask yourself why. Are you profiting off of exploiting other people? As I would define it, you can argue with the definition, but is that why? Are you a capitalist? And if you're a working person, let me just tell you, your interests are not being reflected in the system, and we will help you to see that over the course of our videos. So do subscribe and keep watching. Okay, back to this guy.
And that's the concept that defines that as a concept that John Locke comes up with, which is the idea of individual rights. Individual rights are the moral, it's a moral idea that basically says individuals need to be free to pursue the values that they need in order to succeed in their life, to achieve their happiness. They need to be left free from coercion and force. And rights are a moral concept that defines our relationship in a social context that says force is out. You cannot relate to one another using coercion.
So I hate to keep breaking in. Honestly, I'd like to let more of this run because there's like a half an hour left. But there's so much bullshit in this. So individual rights, and then, not using force. 2 points here. The first is, if you read socialist literature of the mid-19th century and on, the early 20th century and on, one of the key things is that labor and just production generally has become socialized. What does that mean? It means that in the 1600s and the 1700s, people tended to make things more on their own or in very small groups. And then as trade and industry became more global, then any product actually would have been worked on by dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of people, because you're using equipment that was designed in another country and assembled in another country and then shipped by these people. And then it winds up where you are, and 50 different people worked on the assembly line, et cetera, et cetera. So basically looking at how highly socialized the production process is, it doesn't make sense anymore to just use a system which tries to attribute a product to one person. So basically the best way to do this is to look at the working class as a whole. And in socialism, in contrast to, say, anarchism, we don't go for everything to the individual and use just an individual rights lens. It's everything to the masses, and those who belong to that category then get everything through collective ownership. Because we're just at a point now where things have been globalized to a point where you just can't pinpoint this came from this person, except for whatever little cottage industries and artisan things are going on. Even then, though, I suspect that ingredients are coming from different places and, again, equipment. So there's that. And then as far as this whole non-use of force, the United States, which has been the, banner holder leading the charge of capitalism for a couple hundred years, has invaded how many countries now for the purpose of corporate profits and securing more raw materials and opening new markets? This is what capitalism has to do. And to the extent that libertarians say that they support or, are in favor of, theoretically, they propose a kind of capitalism which is free of any of that. They are massive hypocrites. And at best, they don't understand the system that they are championing, because that system cannot do without forceful conquest of new markets and raw materials. It literally runs on exploitation. So this is not possible, but libertarians know that war is not popular, therefore they say that they're against it. However, capitalism requires it. And basically libertarianism is neoliberalism in the sense that neoliberalism was an effort to deregulate, privatize, and defund everything public. And that's exactly what libertarians are for. Not coincidentally, the neoliberal project started in the 70s. Also when the Libertarian Party started was the 70s. And we see that go into effect in the late 70s and especially in the 80s under Reagan. and just on and on and on. It's been this push to privatize, deregulate, and defund. Well, that's exactly what libertarians want. Because of the inherent contrarianism of what they say, it's never enough and they're never satisfied with it. But basically, any libertarian overall should be very happy with the way that things have been going for the last 40 years, because this is the system that they argued for. They just, either lack the capacity of analyzing and understanding what they were arguing for in the first place, or, they just want to push it further. So they're still agitating people to be these like right-wing cranks who just want more and more and more. And they won't be happy until every last square inch of the earth is privatized. So continuing.
So that sounds like it makes a lot of sense in many ways. And the only thing I want to interject here as we start to explore this is when we talk about force, we could imagine force coming in the form of, from an oppressive government in Stalinist communism. We could imagine force coming in a different form from a corporatocracy in which the desires of the average individual person are effectively irrelevant because they don't have the corporate or financial power of large corporations. I mean, if we're properly and widely enough defining force, I think we'll get a lot of agreement on what you've said so far.
Well, I don't think you can widely define force in the way you just did.
Really?
We have to have a clear definition. Force is force. It is inflicting violence on somebody else. It is physically penalizing somebody else for their views, for their actions, for what they've done. And of course, force is appropriate. If there's a murderer out there, you want to physically remove him from the scene, put him in jail, use force to defend yourself. They're appropriate uses of force. But force is not me, convincing you or, intellectually manipulating you as I believe every individual has free will. As long as we interact with one another on a voluntary basis, force has no place in interaction. Let's put corporate force, or how you define corporate force.
No, see, I think that's the problem. I think we're going to disagree there.
For a second.
We're going to, okay.
Okay, so of course Pakman throws in the, it could be Stalinist Russia. This is like the classic sort of libertarian, example, whatever. And then, it could be a corporatocracy. And then Brook, we'll get back to that in a minute, but I want to seize on what Brook is saying. We don't do a lot of libertarians directly on the channel, so I think that this is key. He says that, no, force is just when I hit you in the face, and it's not if I convince you or intellectually manipulate you. Yeah, that's fine, except that we're not talking about influence or manipulation. We're talking about a system where effectively capitalists have all the control. It's completely undemocratic, and they exert that power on a steady basis against the overwhelming majority of people who, if they disobey, will wind up homeless because the basic essentials of life have been commodified. That's the thing. Pakman didn't nail it there. Instead, he's just sort of playing into it. I mean, again, Pakman's views as a left liberal, not so different from this guy, just wants a little more of a cushion and a social safety net. And hey, great. It doesn't make the system any more tenable in the long term. His system relies just as much on imperialism as the naked force libertarian system does, which, I mean, let's face it, like, what are the laws mostly that libertarians want to repeal when they talk about government? It's like workers' protections, environmental protections, things that actually serve the vast majority of people, by and large. We could get all that and more through socialism. In other words, not leaving capitalists in power and begging them to throw us a bone, but removing them from power and then just running society and industry ourselves. That is the socialist vision of what we can do beyond capitalism. That's not really up for debate here, because Pakman will tell you that that necessarily leads to, quote, authoritarianism, whatever. It doesn't make an ounce of sense. So anyway, and as far as Stalinist Russia, the U.S. has more people in prison right now, and that's also relative to overall population. So this whole, human right, communism is bad for human rights and things. human rights are a bourgeois concept, but I mean, just even in the raw outcome of like, they can talk all day long about China, this and that. Look at the US. It's just abysmal. And it is the centerpiece of global capitalism. All right. Anyway, this is just a weird conversation for me to analyze. I don't normally do stuff at this low of a level, so it's kind of throwing me, but let's get back to it.
I'm happy to go back to it, but let's get to capitalism. Let's define capitalism, and then I'm happy to go wherever you want to go.
That's fine. I'll just mention my 15-second interlude is, I think that if we are already a priori defining force in this narrow a way, we are already preempting one of the most important parts of the conversation, but we can come back to it if that's the way.
That's fine.
Yeah.
It's easy to come back to.
Okay.
I'm sure we will. But yes, Ayn Rand is defining force in this, you would think, narrow way, but this is the way force has been defined for a long time. And this is not an unconventional view of force. It's only in the modern world.
That's right. It's outdated in the modern world, I would argue.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say too. I mean, I said it before. This guy's selling you 1776 bourgeois revolutionary ideology again. That's exactly right. It's way outdated. And that's part of the argument for socialism, is that capitalism can no longer govern society. It's just not a compelling vision of the development of industry, the development of humanity. And, that's this guy's like, I live in the past, basically. All right, continuing.
Redefine force to include certain voluntary transactions that people engage in. So if we define force in those terms, then Rand would say we create an institution called government.
Okay, I know he just started talking, but the way he just said that, I just have to point out, this guy is now debating with himself because Pakman just rejected that. He's like, I don't accept your definition of force. And then the guy's like, okay, fine. Well, if we accept force, it's like, no. You're the only one who accepts that definition of force at this table. So I think you've lost already. That's my takeaway, is this guy already just gave up and he cannot compete in this conversation. Go figure.
And the purpose of government, the only purpose of government, because the only threat to individuals and the only threat to reason is force. The purpose of government, the only role of government, therefore, is to extract force from society, to protect us from the use of force by other people, domestically or internationally, to arbitrate disputes between us so we don't revert to force, we don't go out dueling in the streets. So the only purpose of government, according to Rand, is to create an environment in which rational individuals can pursue their values, to pursue their life in pursuit of their own happiness, right? That is it. And anything else that the government does, it by definition violates rights, because government is an agency of force. Government is an agency of coercion, of authority.
That was abysmal. And I don't know how anyone still takes this seriously. So according to this guy, rational individuals, which I guess I am not one of, according to him, because I don't agree with what he's saying at all. The idea is that the only purpose of government, and again, so making this all about government, this is another red herring of libertarianism, because you look, for example, at what communists actually want is to destroy the capitalist government and replace it with a workers' state, which is fundamentally more democratic and which you're never going to get by just modifying the bourgeois government. You need to create something entirely new in its place, just like when the USA was founded, they did not create another monarchy. They set up an entirely new system of government. That is what communists actually argue for. And what these people either can't or won't see, and definitely don't want you to see, is that when a country or society which is established, they've overthrown their capitalists and they are creating a workers' state, a workers' republic that has a workers' government to oversee the building of socialism in that society, in that territory. They just want you to see that country or that region, whatever, interacting with other regions in competition on this same equal plane. That's not it. When the Soviet Union and its allies were fighting with the West, that was a competition between economic systems, not just merely between countries, and so on. When socialism fights with capitalism, it's an economic system basis. It's not like in the world wars where you had Britain against France against Germany. Those were all the same system, imperialists, just fighting for who was top dog. It's a different deal. So they want to reduce everything down to just government is force, and the only purpose of that force is to allow the rational individuals to go about doing what they do. I'm assuming that this is just a euphemism for capitalists, because I am not a capitalist myself personally. Yet I consider myself a rational individual. And I don't like this system. And it's a bad system. And it's not because I want to use force. It's because it's actually using force against me. But according to this guy, it's not. Except he's full of shit. And this is pretty much for me where the conversation ends and where revolutionary impulses begin, because what else can you say? They're not going to change. They're not going to give it up. We'll watch a little bit more of this, but to me, I'm not sure that there really is much else that needs to be said, nor do I think that this guy has much more to offer. Continuing.
So we can move into how that relates to a capitalist system. I mean, I think that this is the problem with, if you define the terms in this way, when you control the inputs, you lead to a seemingly rational output, which I can tell we are going in the direction of being a relatively free market capitalist system. Where
no, relatively,
absolutely free. Okay, so you're going even further. What I think the problem is that it is an improper set of inputs, because when you look at the world as it is, not as it might be in this, the framed way that you're putting together, you see something like, for example, business regulation. That is, by the sort of framework you've established, regulating a business is you're preventing the business from doing what it is that it has determined it wants to do. I mean, I think we get how that's a problem. Yep. But the idea that we hear from some in the libertarian right, that businesses have an incentive to regulate themselves because the PR will be so bad if anybody gets hurt from what they do, it just doesn't happen. It is, I consider it a form of force that businesses, when they are under-regulated, do things that are bad physically for people. I mean, it's not just bad for people's emotions, it's physically bad for people. I consider those forms of force that necessitate a certain degree of government involvement.
So I know, and this is where we're going to disagree.
Yes.
And the disagreement, I think, harkens back to some of the issues in morality. But let me be clear. First of all, I don't like the idea of libertarian right, because I don't know what that means, and the whole right-left spectrum.
Okay, I'm done. We're at almost 40 minutes, and I'm just done with this conversation. So first of all, working backwards, you heard it here. When you hear people like, oh, I don't like the right and left, what does that even mean? They're far right. Libertarians are far right. If you want totally unfettered capitalism, there's a reason people call libertarians neo-feudalists. That's like basically where you wind up. You wind up like right on the verge of like the transition between feudalism and capitalism several hundred years in the past. That's the ideology that they're pushing. And if they're allowed to continue, they will drag our society back to those kinds of conditions. Now, Pakman is making a perfectly normal point. Like, hey, if you're saying force is when I come over and hit you in the face, and you're saying that somehow if a corporation dumps toxic chemicals into my water supply, how is that not punching me in the face, albeit on a molecular level, by poisoning my drinking water that is going to wind up damaging my body and injuring me? How is that not force? But the guy just waves it away, and he wants to live in this theoretical construction that is all his own. These people are ideologically irrelevant. The only reason that you hear from them at all is because they have money, because the system that people like Pakman promote, capitalism, prioritizes people who have money, capitalists, and lets them say whatever the fuck they want, while people like me, and maybe you if you're listening to this channel, who espouse socialist communist ideas, we have to make tiny little underground YouTube channels to talk about this stuff. And I'm hoping that by 2030, if we all push, we can have a moment and go mainstream on this, like actually make communism mainstream, not water down our communism to match the current US mainstream, as some people try to say. That's a really bad idea. But push these ideas and make them mainstream. Change what is the mainstream. Libertarians did this successfully. They were able to push their ideas and they became dominant and normal. Why anyone is listening to this guy, he would have been laughed out of the room 70 years ago. And now it's, people are discussing it and not just merely shutting him down immediately. But see, this is capitalism. All these like left liberals like Pakman, they want this system that leaves capitalists in power. Well, what do you get out of that? You get people like this freak saying what he's saying, arguing for your total enslavement, all while telling you that's not what it is. Anyway, we got another one of these to do, so I'm going to cut it off here before I wind up like tiring myself out ranting about this moron. But yeah, there you have it. I, maybe didn't come down on Pakman super hard. I mean, I think I came down on him, or pointed out at least, the system he wants is why we're even listening to this fucking libertarian in the first place. It's just totally, not only is it insufficient to suppress people like libertarians, I mean, it actively empowers them. So capitalism does, which is what Pakman wants. He didn't even get into that. I mean, and again, it's like talking to libertarians makes even social democrats and radlibs like sound reasonable. But, that's, again, only because the whole thing is skewed so far to the right. Talk to some communists and see how that goes for you, though. So anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Today is the billing day. It's September 1st. So things are still in flux. If you signed up during August, I will update these probably for tomorrow or the next day. So you'll see your name. And then, of course, next month, you'll get a couple of extra days after the month changes over and the billing cycle completes. But we thank you for that. All those donations are very encouraging, and they're also materially helpful. So appreciate that. Liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting, also a big help. The channel has seen a lot of growth, and that's great. So thanks to everybody who has been supporting. Feel free to contact me on Twitter, Socialism S4A. If you have a story idea or just want to say hi, that's always nice. And otherwise, drop a comment. Thanks again. And we'll be back with part 2 of dealing with Yaron Brook. We'll catch you in the next one.